And they are Ginny Lewis. I'll let her introduce herself in just a sec. Myself and Will Miller, who have been working on this together over the past several months, and so all that you see has come from work that we've done together. I'm based in Calgary, Alberta. I'm at the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research and the University of Calgary. And Ginny, over to you.
I'm at La Trobe University in the Australian Institute for Primary Care and Ageing, and I'm a health services researcher.
Thank you. Just making sure I'm, oops, clicking the right place to move the slides. So we wanted to start by talking just a little bit about context, because context has a lot to do with both what we're doing within impact, but also with how we're doing it. And as we all know, the complex context within which we're working in the LIPS and within impact program more broadly is very complex. It is complex within certain guidelines. We're a funded research program that has certain expectations of it. We have outcomes that we want to achieve. But beyond some of the high level expectations and guidelines, there's a lot of opportunity for creativity. Our challenge within this grant, with all of its complexity, is building approaches that account for that complexity while meeting the expectations of the grant. I'll just talk a little bit more about context very briefly. And this is a diagram that many of you would have seen and are becoming quite familiar with. In the center of impact are the 6 local innovation partnerships, around which are the 4 projects that define impact. And so from this, you can see that, that there is a potential for great complexity. We have a large team, we have many participants. There are different contexts within which each of those LIPs are situated that have different economic, policy, and financial influences. And within the team and the people involved, there's differing knowledge, skills, and perspectives, all of which can add strength to this program of research. That's why we've come together, because we believe that the talents we have with us are those that will actually help us to achieve the goals of this complex project. We do, however, need to consider what we do and how we do it and take context into account when we are doing that. Just as an example of some of the things that were expectations and then when we hit reality changed slightly. Initially, when we were thinking about how the LIPS would interact, or the deliberative forums that the LIPS would hold, the local innovation partnerships would hold, we thought that in a fairly straightforward and linear way that there would be a deliberative forum to identify access needs, that there would be perhaps another deliberative forum at which we'd select potential innovations, and so on and so forth. What we've learned in the bottom diagram is that there's actually a lot more back and forth interaction with communities, with the LIP core team, between the research team and the core teams. And we're building that in as we go. And that's largely because of our commitment to taking context into account and recognizing that in order to do this well and to leave something that is sustainable in the long term, that connection between the research team and the LIPS is an integral part of this work, and working in partnership is foundational for achieving our goals. So the implications for that complexity, some of them are that we need to build into the program of research approaches that support learning and improvement in the program and in our processes while we're doing it. And that requires really strong communication across the LIPS within the research team, and we've built in many strategies to achieve that. We'll be asking you some questions about how we're doing there as we go, but I'll turn it over now to Ginny to just talk a little bit about the rapid evaluation that we did do early on last fall And I want to thank Ricky Lane and Laura
Oh,
Lagendijk,
she
who were
froze
instrumental in doing that work
for
for
me.
us.
I hope that you can hear me.
Just to give you a sense of some of the things we learned as we went, and how that is informing our next steps. Over to you, Ginny.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. As Kathy said, just about everybody on the line here knows about the evaluation work that was done at the end of last year, and Ricky knows it intimately because he did the series of interviews with Laura. So thank you, Ricky. The reason that we did this is for all the things that Kathy was saying in terms of the importance of understanding the context and how that affects what happens in each of the catchments that we call LIPs. And so we did this rapid evaluation, we called it, because it was done very quickly. We did it before we had the meeting of the Canadian and Australian team at NAPCRAG. So one of the reasons we did it quickly was because we wanted to be able to feed into that meeting and look at anything that was going on and consider what was happening in the LIPs in a sort of slightly different way to the way that you do every day when you're actually participating in them. So the purpose was to get a good understanding of what was actually happening at that point in time with those LIPs, to consider how they were working and how people who were participating in them considered them to be operating, what they, what everybody thought they were meant to be doing, whether they were doing it, and so on. Also then to consider that could form a baseline for us when we're considering what the processes and outcomes of those learning partnerships might be. So as we've said before, it's difficult, particularly with a program of research that Impact is, that goes for so many years. It's difficult to actually have a coherent understanding of what happened, and it's in some senses it's easy to retrospectively come up with a narrative that suits and that represents people's interpretation of what happened. But it's actually important to have a contemporaneous record of what was going on and to get their conversations going. So that was what we were up to. The way that we did it was to have interviews with 2 or 3 people in each LIP. And as I say, just about everybody on this call, not everybody, but nearly, took part in those interviews. And they were very much focused on process, which was the intent of them. There were questions about how each LIP was organised, how they were operating, what the relationships they were forming were. There was a quite sort of tricky section really about how you were doing each of the functions that's actually described in the LIP implementation guide. And then there was a conversation with everybody involved about risks and the strategies that they may see for addressing those risks within each LIP. And that, as I say, was particularly important as we went into that NAPCRAG meeting, and we'll come to those again. So let me do the thing. So just a very quick overview. We presented a quick overview at the NAPCRAG meeting, but we've actually, Kathy and I have just finished writing a brief summary, which we will send around after we've finished the webinar and it's been ticked off by the international exec, because that's the way that the impact team works. So we put things through the international exec so we do all know what's going on. So that document's sitting with PIs at the moment, and we'll get that back and then send it out to everybody. So just a couple of the things in that briefly, not going too long. One of the things that was notable was that the language, the terminology that people use within their LIPs to describe what their structures are and the sort of governance arrangements was quite varied. There wasn't a sort of set language, I would say, for describing how your LIP is set up. And the question we asked was, about your core group. So people sort of interpreted their core groups in different ways. But at the end of the day, the structure within the LIPs is very similar in that there's a small group which is usually the LIP PI, the lead and the coordinator, and they have the key sort of operational role. And what they're called, as I say, varies, but they are the group that's having the day-to-day running, and they are mostly you people. And then there's another group which is a bit of a more strategic and in some cases actually has an oversight role. It actually has that sort of notion of having it looks like from where we sit, a reasonable amount of control and capacity to direct the project. as well. And so that particular group was called a core team, a LIP core team in Canada, and a management committee in Australia and Ottawa. Ottawa called it a management committee at that point too. Remember, this is point in time. One of the things we'll be doing is coming back and seeing to what extent these things are still looking like this. The key partnerships that were reflected in those governance arrangements were with the researchers, policy advisors, and local health authorities. In Australia, that was very much where the focus of relationships was sitting at that time. In Canada, there was much more participation of family physicians and other health professionals. So that was a stronger characteristic in the Canadian LIPS than the Australian LIPS. And at that time, and probably still, everybody was talking about how and where to engage consumers in the governance of the impact grant. And as I say, that may be something that's not, well, I'm sure it's still being discussed. In the other sort of differences were ones that we've always been aware of because they reflect the different context in which the context for primary care in Canada and Australia. So as you all know by now, I'm sure, in Australia we have, until the end of June, primary care organisations that are called Medicare locals. And in each case, our LIPS in Australia are very closely linked to those Medicare locals. And that's a sensible alignment because the Medicare locals core business is around ensuring that there is access to primary health care for all people in Australia. So the issues that we're dealing with are completely central and pertinent to Medicare locals. So those relationships are there. And in a couple of cases, those relationships are such that the Medicare local actually is funding the organisation that the CI is in. So that's that's a very close relationship to have. In the case of the Canadian LIPS, and again, those who are involved know more about this than I do, but there are different sort of arrangements around primary care organisations across the provinces in Canada, and so that's also reflected in the arrangements that are there for impact. There didn't seem, and again we'll be checking this, but it didn't seem that there were any actual financial relationships where the funding was flowing from the primary care organisations into either the impact PIs or their teams in some sense. So they were sort of some of the smaller differences, but there's obviously a lot of similarities since people are working from the same song sheet basically. We also asked questions about what the purpose of the LIPS was, and there were a lot of different views about, because again, it's quite an open question intentionally. There were a lot of different views about what the purpose of LIPS is, and everybody talked about the role that a LIP has in supporting the practical implication of the impact grant, of course. So the idea that it's there to help to implement the different projects that constitute the impact grant, and with a particular sort of lead up to the project to the intervention. The idea that the purpose of the LIP is to ground the research, and so that the information from those participants in those management groups or LIP core groups is around ensuring that the researchers understand the context. So that was a clear sort of view. And the idea that it's actually engaging stakeholders so that there may be the opportunity to fund the intervention too. So that's actually, again, which is part of the practical role and the supporting role that LIPs have, supporting the impact grant. And a couple of people talked about the idea that the LIPs were a model to support research and to ensure that research has more impact in policy and in practice. So the other question that we're just going to talk about today is just about risks and strategies. So we asked people what they perceived the risks to be for the impact program, for impact, the work of impact in general. And the first one, not surprisingly, was around the changes in policy context. And in Australia, as again, I'm sure most of you are aware, the Medicare locals which have only been in existence for a few years, having replaced a previous form of primary care organisation, are also now on their way out, and a new way of working is on its way in their primary health organisations. So that was, everybody considered that to be a risk in Australia. And in Canada, there were also similar kinds of risks in terms of changes in government, changes in policy, changes in the way services are funded. So one of the comments in one of the provinces was that there is a move to more of a non-physician focused model of primary healthcare, and that could be a risk. There was also concern about funding, so particularly funding reductions to Aboriginal health services, and that may mean that the services might be. It was interesting that that person recognised that could either be a risk or it could be an opportunity, because on the one hand the services may have less money and may need and look for more assistance, and on the other they may have less money and not really have time to talk about anything except their core business. And I think that's what's sort of exciting in a way about the impact work being so grounded in the context and being particularly sorry, I'm just seeing that we're having audio problems, it says down there. I'm going to keep going because I can't hear them, so I'm just going to keep going. So yeah, the idea that because it is recognising context very overtly and thinking about it, that it gives us an opportunity to consider things in a quite complex way, and to recognise that the same event and the same aspect of context can be both a positive and a negative for the grant. The other risks that were seen were around maintaining stakeholder engagement. Okay, we're getting lots of audio issues, and should I just keep going or should I pause at this point? What's the recommendation from our technical facilitators? Are you getting issues, Kathy? Julie just said she's not.
No.
No, okay, I'm going to keep going. All right. Sorry if you are having issues. I'm going to keep going. So the maintaining stakeholder engagement was an issue that a lot of people talked about, and they talked about it from the perspective of a range of stakeholders. So from stakeholders in terms of the colleagues we're working with who are either policy advisors or service providers, there was a recognition that engaging them, it has to be in their interests, it has to be useful or you lose them, that there's a potential for burnout, that because we're talking about vulnerable populations and there's a lot of attention to the needs of vulnerable populations, the services involved can have too much to do, and again, it's about making it important. But there was also recognition that we are the stakeholders too, that the members of the LIP research teams are stakeholders, and keeping everybody engaged in what is quite a complex, large, multi-component piece of work is quite difficult too. The how and when to engage vulnerable consumers, as I said before, that was something that came up through the interviews at different points in the interview in relation to different questions. Most of our interviewees commented on how difficult it was to know when and how to engage consumers, and we know that's not an issue just for this grant. That's a common issue. Lack of funding for innovations was obviously a risk, and that's a risk that we've known about since the start. The idea that there may just not be funding available. Nobody may have any money to actually contribute to innovation if there is money required, even if it's part of their core funding, it might be difficult. And also there was a couple of people I think spoke about the fact that because the intervention has to be funded from the partners, then queried to the extent to which the choice and the use of evidence to select the intervention was actually as free and open as you would have liked it to be if you could have said, we've got money and we can choose to do almost anything. The changes in impact team members was raised as a risk that each, particularly people who, as I say, a lot of who are on the call now, who have a very close role in building the relationships and supporting the LIP, because the recognised risk was that if people leave and they are the personal contact that has helped to build those relationships, there is a risk in transferring those relationships and that trust. And then management of the grant, the impact itself, there were risks seen around that. There was people talked about having a lack of potential to have a lack of clarity about where we're heading. The risks around not having a clear interface between the projects and projects not being perceived as relevant in different LIP groups. And also, again, the potential to have a restriction of the scope of impact because stakeholders had their own agenda, which of course is what we want and we're inviting them to bring to the whole the whole grant, but it also may influence what we do, which may contrast or potentially conflict with what the wishes of some impact researchers are. So they were all issues and that people raised, or potential risks that they saw there. And what we were going to do now, Kathy's disappeared from the screen, but what we were going to do, we wanted you to answer a question here. And I don't think I have to do anything, but here we go. So the question is, and we want you to only choose one, which of those risks, issues, areas of risk that we have just mentioned, would you consider is the highest risk for impact from your perspective? And you just need to click on one. And I think there were about 8 people on, so you don't have to vote if you don't want to, but it's more fun if you do. Okay. Right. I think that's about all, isn't it?
It is, yep.
So clearly, the having lack of funding for innovations is, in this group at this time, the number one risk, followed by changes in policy context and maintaining stakeholder engagement. That's great. Okay, thank you. What I want to do now then is just to tell you what at the time we asked people, the interviewees, to reflect on what some of the ways that these risks could be addressed might be. So we asked for ideas of strategies. So in at least the order of those first 3, in fact, the issue of lack of funding for innovations, there weren't a lot of strategies suggested at this point. So, and there is one more question to come to, and then there's some ideas for follow-up conversations that people might like to have, and also for things that the impact executive might like to pick up. One of the comments that was made in considering how you might address that potential risk around lack of funding of innovation was to be very clear that stakeholders know from the start that there is no funding. So that's a sort of secondary risk in some senses, that A, there's no funding, and B, people don't realise that at the start, and if they don't realise, then you'll crash into the other issue that was identified, which is stakeholder engagement. So being very clear from the start that we don't have the funding and that the purpose of bringing people together is to think about shared action that's possible. And the other suggestion that was made was that there needs to be local funding identified, so funding that is available locally in existing programs. So it's more about adapting what is existing work that's being done than actually suggesting something is completely new. And that means using staff and using services and redirecting their activity, rather than saying, we need 3 new staff with new skills who come in and do something new you've never done before. So they were the suggestions that came up in those interviews, and we were at that stage, of course, getting to the end of the interview, so people were, I'm sure, getting quite tired. The changes in policy context, which was the second or the equal second issue that was just ticked then. In that one, mostly people said you just have to sort of go with the flow and keep in touch with the other LIPs to see how they're managing the change. One of the other suggestions was that even if the structures around the LIP are changing, so for instance, Medicare Locals becoming primary health networks in Australia, that you keep the same people on your governance group. So keep the same people on the LIP core team or the management committee, so that you've got that continuity of the individual's perspective. Now, that may or may not work depending on whether they actually are still in the organisation at all, but that was the suggestion. And just recognising the need to be flexible with the structural changes that are taking place. But as I say, most of the people who spoke to that issue talked about just adapting as it went along, being flexible, but making sure that across the LIPs everybody knew what they were doing to adapt to those circumstances, and that's obviously important for the evaluation too. And then maintaining stakeholder engagement. The kinds of things that came out were really around having communication strategies that recognised the different stakeholders we have and had layers of communication. So updates and relevant messages to people, focusing on trying not to overburden people, so focusing on what things have been done, recognising the efforts that have been there and trying not to overburden. Ensuring that processes keep on track so people don't get frustrated if things seem to, people remain informed, they're kept informed so that they know what's going on and they're not feeling frustrated. So really a lot around communication. And one of the other comments in that area too was around, again, overlaps with the previous concern about funding for an intervention, was to recognise that you need to engage people on the ground as well, because they are the people who are probably going to be involved in actually rolling out an intervention. So recognising, as you can see very much, that there are layers of stakeholders and different kinds of stakeholders who therefore need different kinds of communication and engagement. And I think that was quite important. With the management, the other issues that were there, we talked about with the changes people talked about with the changes to the impact team, making sure we document what people know and keep track of who knows whom and where there may be a loss of contact if someone actually leaves. The management of the grant, a lot of it was around the clarity, the connection between projects, having ongoing dialogue, having webinars like this. So again, a lot of communication and ensuring some consistency. So the last bit for me is the next question. So those were the issues that were raised, and they were some of the suggestions, and you hopefully can see that in fact some of the things that were discussed have been implemented, for instance webinars. So the question we have at this point, and you can choose as many of these as you like, of these risks that have already been identified, are there any that you think the Impact International Executive could be doing more to address? So the question is basically asking for you to indicate to us what we might take back to the International Exec from this webinar to raise as things that they should talk about. We're just about done. Haven't seen a number move. So as I say, you can put down as many of them as you like, and it may or may not give us just a bit of a sign of, we will definitely take it to the International Executive and say this is what this group said. Still moving, so wait a sec. Okay, is everybody in still moving? All right. Okay, I think it's set. Yep. Okay, so you can see there that maintaining stakeholder engagement and lack of funding for innovations remain at sort of top of the board, but engaging vulnerable consumers and managing the grant itself are also recognised as things that the International Executive could do more to address. So we'll take those things. The other thing I would suggest too is that that you will, as I say, we'll send you this summary document which has these things in it, and I'm assuming that someone has written down the results of those polls. They're probably recorded somewhere. We can circulate that too. But you can take this, anything that comes from today, and take it back to your own LIP as well. So consider those issues within your own LIP, which, as I say, I'm sure you are. But it also highlights that they are things that we need to keep monitoring as we go forward. Thank you. That's all for the poll. And I think I'm done. Back to Kathy.
So I'm just going to get started. And Ginny, I turned off my webcam because we were checking to see if that would
Yep.
solve the audio issues. I'm not sure if it did or not, but
I'll
I'll
take
just
mine off at
leave
this
it off
point.
and go from there. So as you heard Ginny describe, what we learned from this is we learned many things from the rapid evaluation, but it did confirm for us the importance of ongoing monitoring and evaluation with an intent to feed information back to the LIPs as we go to support them. And what we did find, and Ricky and others can speak to this because they were quite involved with the interviews, was that people were very, very interested in hearing about what was happening in the other LIPs and learning from what was working and what wasn't. And so the intent with this evaluation approach that we're taking is to address some of that, but also to inform next steps with the grant. So just a quick overview. Many of you may well know a lot about developmental evaluation, and if I had my preference, I would call it developmental planning, implementation, and evaluation because there are elements of each of those in it. More traditional forms of evaluation, summative and formative, work well when you know what you're doing and you know the outputs you want to generate and the impact you're going to have. That's not so much the case with this grant. We do know some of that in broad strokes, but what we're working with in this context, in these contexts, looks more like this. There are many different inputs. We're not sure where they will come out and how they will come out. The outputs are emerging as we go. So how do you design an approach to monitoring and evaluation that helps in a context like that? We also want to emphasize that um, there are elements of single, double, and triple loop learning in the work that we're doing. So we are trying to learn about how the actions we take can influence results and adjust those. So are we doing things right? Can we do them better? Possibly. But we also want to know if we're doing the right things and maybe change what we're doing as we go. That's changing our assumptions of what works and what doesn't, which has a knock-on effect on actions and subsequently results. And for triple loop learning, we also need to think about how do we decide what is right. We do a lot of thinking on that level as well and learning on that level. So what can we do in the context within the LIPS, within the projects to make changes that influence the context that we're in, which again influence both double and single loop learning. And this is built into the developmental approach to learning and evaluation. Just another fairly simplistic table that talks about the types of evaluation and summative, formative, and developmental. And I want to stress that the distinctions aren't this clear. Um, the context that developmental evaluation is used in is for this type of context, which is complex and there's change. Um, there can be elements of summative, formative process evaluations within a developmental evaluation. The big difference with it is that it builds that ongoing learning cycle into the work that's done and that it does build in strategies to take complexity into account. This is another graphic to attempt to illustrate that so that we've, within Impact, within our LIPS, had many opportunities to have dialogue with communities and learn from our many stakeholders about what works and what doesn't. We have collected data and analyzed that, sometimes in collaboration with folks, other times um, not not so collaboratively, and both are okay depending on the type of work that we're doing at the time. We use that for decision making to determine what and how we implement and to learn more about what works and what doesn't. And those cycles of learning and development continue throughout the developmental evaluation process with what we're learning feeding back continuously. This is just another um, slide that illustrates this process and more specifically within impact. There's a bit of a problem with this in that some of the text related to impact is not showing up. But the intent is throughout impact, project one, project two, the things we do help to generate these and inform the learning and evaluating piece of the work, and that when the things that we do come together with the reflection and opportunities for generating ideas about change, it influences how we think about what we're doing and how to do things differently. So again, I'm just going to move through these because they're not showing up quite as they should, but built into these cycles of learning and doing are each of the steps within impact. And as you can see with the um, text at the far right-hand side of that slide, it's it's all about using what we learn to refine the prototypes based on what comes out of the projects and the lessons learned from each of the LIPs. So I'll just move on to this. So the methods that we're planning to use involve online survey, and I'll get Ginny to jump in any point here too. Um, for April and May, more likely May, a survey that will target LIP core and management teams, asking questions specific to the work that is intended to be done and done up until this point in the LIPs. We are planning annual site visits and targeting members of the LIPS at all levels, and through those site visits, both before and during and after the site visits, we'll be doing interviews, group interviews, observing what's happening perhaps in some of the community engagement work, and also looking at all of the documents that we're asking people to generate. So the diaries that we've asked people, will be asking for some extracts from diaries that people have been maintaining, mostly the LIP coordinator and research assistants with the LIPs, but also the PIs to help us reflect on how things are influencing how people interact with the work. But also the meeting minutes that people are keeping and all of that documentation will be taken into consideration to help inform what's working, what's not, and how we move on. And we will be also once a year asking people, and we have yet to really confirm how we're going to do this, whether it's interviews or again survey. What has been some of the most significant change that you've seen? What new issues have emerged to influence the activities of the LIP? And we will be reporting back to people. So we will be bringing results of the evaluation back to the national and international exec for diffusion and dissemination to members of those LIPs that each of the PIs is associated with, but also more formal updates, which would include potentially webinars such as this without the technological difficulties, Ricky, and a summary report like the one that we will be sending out soon. Ginny, did you want to add anything there?
No, Kathy, I think that's fine.
Okay. So the implications of doing this type of evaluative work are that, and we've just listed one major one here with a few sub items, but strengthening our ability to convey what actually happened in impact. We are looking at different contexts across 2 countries, and while we may have some definite outcome measures at the end, we need to be able to state why why the outcomes were achieved and how they were achieved, so that we can determine how to support and use the evidence to inform implementation, but so that we can also inform implementation in other contexts beyond impact. So I'll stop there for any questions and answers. We've got about 20 minutes left, and just Ginny, anything you want to add, or we'll just open it to questions.
I'm happy to see if there's any questions, Kathy.
All right. So if you have any questions, I've turned the mics on for everybody. So you just have to click at the top of your screen on the little green mic icon. If you want to ask a question, I'd invite you to raise your hand first, just to avoid speaking over each other.
So given that we've passed the 10-second silence without questions, I might just pose one, and I'm sure there are others that other members of the executive team might have. Simone is also typing. Um, so you can type your questions as well as she is doing. But my question, we will be sending out this report. We will summarize also the results of those little polls and take that back to exec for discussion. But we also, based on what we heard from the polls and the issue of supporting the local innovations and finding support for that, are there any ideas that people have related to that, or any thoughts that people have shared with others, but maybe we can discuss here? This is an unusual silence for this group.
Simone, you can go ahead.
Okay, you can see my hand raised? Okay. I might have raised it 3 times because I see 3 next to Simone. I wasn't sure how to make this thing work. Um, so this was really well done, really interesting, very clear. When you were on the last segment and you were talking about the perspective component of the evaluation, I guess I might have had like a little lapse or it went a little fast. And so I wanted to hear a little more about what was being planned. So a survey is being done sometime probably in May. And then the visit, so this would be a visit by a member of the evaluation team.
Yes,
So that's the
these
question.
things,
Yeah.
some of the actual logistics of it have yet to be confirmed with executives. So Ginny and I have put our proposal forward, and I think Grant's got his hand up, so he may be able to answer this better. But the original thought was that we would have a person, one in Canada, one in Australia, that works with Ginny and I, who would be helping to coordinate that and implement the data collection strategy. Um, and that's part of what we've discussed in terms of getting some dedicated support for the evaluation work to be undertaken. So we were being a little less specific than we probably would otherwise, just because we know that we are taking some of this to the international exec next week and want to confirm it there. Grant, did you want to add
Yeah,
to
my
that?
question.
Oh, sorry, Simone, go ahead.
My question was more just to make this, because it's fairly short time frame, maybe when you know sort of what you're going to do, just to make it optimal for you, we could start to think about bringing a group together, or how do you, because you're thinking of group interviews, or so yeah, so just I'm starting to
Yes.
think about, okay, who would we start to pull together to be ready for you?
That's
And we will
fabulous.
very much do it in collaboration with you. The timelines may differ than what we have here on the slide. These were the originally proposed and timelines. So it may all be staggered a little bit later in the year, but definitely before we do anything, we'll make sure that that the timing is right and it works for people to be getting together. For example, going into winter in Australia might be easier to get groups together. In Canada, we may um, either need to do it in June or wait until September to do the visits. So it's all to be determined more specifically as we're going into
But it would
summer
be
here.
good to Yeah, when I've been involved in this sort of thing in the past, it has been a case of trying to pick to join into a meeting that's already planned. So one of the things would be, and we can do that even even while we wait for confirmation from the international exec about exactly what's happening, we could. It would be useful to get a list of when your LIPCOR or management committee meetings are, and whether or not we can actually have a visit around that and use and get a sort of half hour at most on the agenda at those meetings to talk about some of to run some questions around the broader evaluation questions that we've got. So that'd be good. We could perhaps discuss that also at exec next week.
Grant, you had your hand raised if you had anything to add or a question.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. I'm just trying to work the technology out. So, look, first of all, I just wanted to thank Ginny and Kathy, and also the team at McGill for the presentation, because I think it was really clear, and I really appreciate the chance to get everyone together. I wanted to ask a question about sort of a bit of an open question about the developmental evaluation, which was what surprised you about the evaluation? What were the sort of things that you didn't expect or didn't anticipate about from the findings?
And that's more from the rapid
You mean with the
evaluation.
rapid evaluation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Do you want to go first, Kathy?
Sure. And Ginny and I have started work together enough now that we're starting to complete each other's sentences. So I'm assuming
it's a
that'll
real
be
worry.
the case now. It's very worrying. But I think one of the things that was surprising, and I'm just going to go back to the slide about, if I can do it here, rapid evaluation results summary, was the purpose of the LIPS, the difference, we expected that there would be differences in structure and governance because of the very different contexts. But I think that the differences in people's perception of the purpose of the LIPS was a little something that I wouldn't say that it surprised us, but it was very, very important for us to be aware that some groups were thinking very much within the research project, and others were thinking of the broader, thinking of that as well as broader implications or broader purposes of the LIPS going beyond impact and what it was actually stimulating within communities. Ginny, do you have anything to add there or contradict?
No, I would agree with that, and I won't do any violent agreement, so I'll leave it at that.
Could I just ask one follow-up question as to whether you noticed any keenness or willingness for the LIPS or wish for the LIPS to be learning what other LIPS were doing and getting to meet people from the other LIPS, either in the same country or beyond. And the reason I asked the question is that it was from when we sort of first had the very first discussions around this, I was quite struck by some of the people within our LIPS enthusiasm about meeting and speaking with others. But I'm interested to know whether that was reflected elsewhere.
Absolutely.
It was, and
yeah.
yeah, but also when you read the report, you get a bit more of a bit more of the subtlety. But there were interviewees who were aware of inconsistencies and or lack of clarity, I suppose. So yeah, there was a lot of interest in knowing what others were doing, and part of the motivation for wanting to know that was for how it would actually help them, so it might actually be useful to know, but also from some people, particularly if they weren't, the PIs who tended to have a sort of stronger idea of what they thought was going on and so on. They were interested because they may not get that just within their own lip. So having the conversations that were about the big things like purpose and who does what, and thinking through where things should be similar and where things should be different and so on. So yes.
So there's sort of this hunger for understanding that people have got, and sometimes
communicating. That's right, and it was, as I say, the stakeholders include not just the external sort of people who are distant from us, but people talked about stakeholders being the people on this call and the people who are not on this call but have similar roles to people on this call. So we are all stakeholders, and it's a big complex project with a lot of differences which are intended but which need to be managed so that people realise that that's not uncontrolled chaos, it's controlled chaos. And so getting that sort of understanding and shared understanding, I think, came through as something that quite a few people would like to have work on.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's great.
You're welcome. And Gowan has had his little hand up for a long time. It's probably getting sore by now. Gowan, did you want to ask a question or comment? No?
Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I've got just every button I can see on the screen. I must have got the right one. So I'll just echo Grant's appreciation of this webinar, which is incredibly useful to get a feel for what's happening across. And as I've been listening, it strikes me that of necessity, a lot of what we've heard is looking at the present and backwards to how we got here. And I wonder, is there some processes going on of predicting what's going to be coming up for different LIPs and allowing other people across the project to pose some questions of things that they're interested in finding out? And what makes me think of this is that we're just about to dive into primary health network land in Australia. And so we're heading straight into the impact of changes in policy. And there might well be some questions or issues or thoughts that people from Canada who are not facing that at the moment may have, or may be interested in learning, that it would be good to have on our agendas now, so we can be a bit thoughtful about it. So I just wonder if there's a little bit of if there's a forward-looking agenda of that kind.
That's actually a really nice idea, Gowan. I'm hearing more echoing. And I think that it's something actually we could definitely talk about, similar to other opportunities with it in impact, but actually piggybacking some of the questions that investigators and others who are on the team more broadly have related to impact, and how it would address one of those issues or risks that came up, which was about keeping stakeholders engaged and keeping team members engaged, and how we might do that better. So, Ginny, I don't know, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a really good question, and it might be something to have a chat about after the webinar too, if that's possible, Gowan.
I want to acknowledge also that the comment from Victoria, that they, in terms of my question related to the innovation, that they have put in an application for some support. And the more we can learn about what people are doing there, the better as we go. So that will be something we pick up as we talk with the LIPs, for sure. Were there other questions or comments?
It's Melanie. It's Melanie Ann. I do have just a quick question. I'm wondering if you saw a lot of contradictions within the LIPs, within each LIP, as to what people were perceiving as the risks or ways to address that?
Not a lot of contradiction within the lips. In some senses, the risks part was the most consistent, or was where you got the most consistent views within a lip compared with the other bits. So it was interesting that there was actually probably more consistency in those and the understanding of what the risks were than there was in people talking about either the structure of their lip or the purpose of their lip. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. I see Gowan has his hand up, so we have just about 2 minutes left before the webinar is over.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wondered if you noticed any, I was thinking of the issue of lack of resources for interventions, and I wondered if you've noticed a difference between places where engagement with primary health organisations or similar arrangements in fact gave LIPS an opportunity to shape what happened and therefore have an intervention that piggybacked on existing health service processes versus where people were having to build it themselves in their garage.
I think it's probably. So can you mute again, Gal? Thanks. I think it's what we're going to see in the future. So it is. I think that's one of the very key things that we want the developmental evaluation to be looking at. So we'll get a sense over the next 12 months or even less about how the interventions are going to be funded within each LIP, and then one of the questions will be to say to consider to what extent the structures, the governance, the processes that ran within each LIP actually contributed to that particular outcome and the context. And of course, as the spaghetti picture showed, it's all a very complex web. So it's up to all of us who are part of Impact to attempt to interpret what goes on. But I think that is one of the questions, whether or not there are certain structures which encourage a redesign using existing resources, or whether there are certain approaches and ways of doing things that don't lead to that point as clearly, or are more successful in getting completely new funding. So I think that's one of the questions that we've got. Kathy, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, and it's one of the very reasons why we want to do the evaluation this way, is so that we can capture what's actually happened and potentially make some connection to what the outcomes were, and from there think about how we might do implementation differently next time. So there's a lot to be learned, definitely, and that question that you asked, Gowan, is one that we definitely have.
All right, well, thank you, Kathy and Virginia, for your presentation, and thank you, everybody, for being here. So if you missed out on little parts of it because of the audio issues, I'm sorry. The presentation was recorded, and it'll be available on Partage very soon. So thank you very much, and have a good day in Australia, good evening in Canada.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.